Today we are talking about Butch Cassidy's secret cabin. Who is Butch Cassidy? He is a Utah outlaw that lived in the Utah mountains. The music was provided by the governor himself. He was a man of many accomplishments, a doctor, politician, and guitarist who could pick out most any regional favorite. Tonight it was the Brazilian samba, plus a new style that was just emerging in Argentina, the melancholy tango. Somewhere in the party, mingling with ease and leading the festivities, because this was their house, their life, were three people, each with a $10,000 bounty on their head. Back home they were criminals, efficient and daring experts in the art of separating powerful people from their money. Here, under new names, they were upstanding citizens, free from the past. Any of the two hosts, James Santiago Ryan, had once worked as a butcher, and outside the cabin, he must have cast a critical eye on the men grilling the lamb and beef. The other man, Henry Enrique Place, spoke better Spanish than his friend and business partner, and would have spent more of the evening inside with Ethel, his wife. She was the one who made this frontier house sparkle, the social one, the music teacher who spoke Spanish well, whose elegant presence remade the lives of three criminal fugitives into something whole and wholesome looking. Despite having her face on wanted posters all over the globe, she took a turn around the cabin floor with Dr. Lizama. The party lasted until 2 a.m. The governor himself stayed overnight as a guest of Place and Ryan. In another life, they had gone by other names. Many other names, in fact. The men put on aliases the way other people put on coats. In Argentina, they hoped to conceal forever the names history would remember them by, Butch and Sundance. In the 1969 Oscar-winning film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the famous outlaws are shown escaping America to a decrepit village in Bolivia. According to the movie version, they died side by side, guns blazing, in the crosshairs of half a Bolivian regiment. It's a great Hollywood ending that happens to be true. Mostly, they left America, then died in Bolivia. What Hollywood didn't know is that Butch and Sundance escaped. For 6 years they managed to elude the most powerful detectives on the planet and outrun their past across the wilds of South America. Hidden, for years, in the tranquil frontiers of Patagonia and the deep forests of the Andes, they started new lives as law-abiding citizens. They rode cattle, built ranches, and spent their ill-gotten gains on glorious living, including tango parties and cabin concerts where a governor, and even lawmen charged with arresting them, were honored guests. They tried to let go of the past, but they were hounded for a crime which we now know they did not commit, and the past caught up with them. Found out, the Old West's smartest robbers responded by going on an epic spree of bank jobs that filled their saddlebags and humiliated law enforcement in 3 countries. Given the real story of what Butch and Sundance pulled off in South America, it's no wonder the authorities tried to forget those years. Honesty is the best disguise, the ultimate trick for such famous criminals. During the 1890s, Robert LeRoy Parker and Harry Longabaugh, aka Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, carried out a streak of bank robberies across 5 U.S. states with the help of a revolving host of associates known as the Hole in the Wall Gang. Often planned by the meticulous Butch and executed by the quick-thinking Sundance, their crimes made the most of preparation and timing, and were justifiably famous for their panache and profit. Butch was a lapsed Mormon who nursed a grievance against the high and mighty. He deliberately targeted the most powerful banks and financial interests, and while his crimes were usually nonviolent, his plans grew increasingly ambitious and elaborate with practice. In 1898, he escalated his hoard dramatically by boarding an express train of the Union Pacific Railroad in Wyoming. After politely releasing the passenger carriage, the gang swiped $30,000 from the train's safe, along with diamonds and negotiable banknotes. They blew a bridge to prevent pursuit, and when Sundance was later cornered by a sheriff's posse, he managed to shoot his way out and escape. The H. Cherryman, owner of the Union Pacific, hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to track the men down and eventually raise the price on their heads from $1,000 to $10,000 each. The gang responded by pulling off a string of rapid-fire robberies over the next 2 years, hitting trains and banks and escaping with impunity. Sympathetic and charismatic, able to vanish overnight into rural wilderness, they executed their heists with such audacity, it was as if they were toying with the banks and powerful corporations they robbed. But they were smart enough to know the streak couldn't last forever. Sometime in 1899, they started making plans to get out. In a letter to a friend, Butch explained what made their flight to South America possible. $30,000 they had inherited from an uncle. The wild bunch robberies in the US, anyway. But instead of fleeing into the deepest badlands of Idaho or Wyoming as before, the trio of Butch, Sundance, and Ethel hid in another kind of wilderness, the teeming streets of New York City. By this point, they were not a duo but a trio. Ethel, not Etta, as history misrecalls her, began to associate with the wild bunch of the 1890s. Pinkerton reports, one source for their South American idyll, described her as 5'5" and quite thin, with pale skin, green eyes, and brown hair. In photos, she has the calm self-possession of many a beautiful woman. There are more absences than known facts in her record. No last name, no evidence of a legal marriage, no letters, no clue as to her final fate. but she and Sundance were already a common-law couple of many years by the time they left for South America, and he introduced her as his wife, even to his family in Pennsylvania. Decades later, his grandnieces would identify her, perhaps fancifully, as a West Virginia-born music teacher. But the only solid data tells a less charming story. As Ann Meadows relates in her book Digging Up Butch and Sundance, Ethel had resided for a time in Fort Worth, Texas, at an address near the cattle yards that was listed as a Class A house of prostitution. The frontier drew many young women into brothels, and virtually all of them would be looking for a way out. By 1900, Sundance and Butch were on the way out of the hemisphere with her. In January 1901, the trio took the best suite in a boarding house on East 12th Street, about a 20-minute walk from the offices of their nemesis, Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The outlaws spent a month living large. Butch bought a gold watch at Tiffany's for the modern equivalent of $1,200, and Sundance and Ethel had their picture taken at a celebrated photography studio. On February 20th, they boarded the SS Herminia, a luxurious new steamship which offered only first-class accommodations, and set sail for South America. The Herminia delivered the trio to Rio de Janeiro, where they spent several months considering Brazil as a home, before moving on to Argentina. In Buenos Aires, they sampled the cafes and parks of a fast-rising capital city, its ports thronging with immigrants from every part of Europe, its wide avenues lined with aristocratic mansions and European architecture. It even had a new underground train, like those in London.